It was November 1994. In a warehouse in New Jersey, retail workers were unboxing a product that Sega's own engineers had privately called a mistake 6 months before it shipped. The box was black. It plugged into the top of the Sega Genesis like a tumor. It promised 32-bit graphics on a console that was already 3 years old. It cost $159. It launched with 6 games. It would be discontinued in less than 18 months. Sega called it the 32X. The gaming press eventually called it something else. A disaster. A betrayal. The product that taught an entire generation of consumers that Sega would sell them anything, abandon it immediately, and move on without apology. This is not the story of a bad product. The 32X was not technically bad. This is the story of a company so terrified of the future that it released 3 incompatible futures simultaneously and destroyed the trust that had taken a decade to build. In a single holiday season, to understand what the 32X actually was, you have to understand what Sega was afraid of in 1993. The Genesis had been a miracle of positioning. In 1989, Nintendo owned everything. The NES had 90% market share, a stranglehold on third-party developers, and a brand so dominant that parents called every console a Nintendo, regardless of who made it. Sega of America, under a marketing executive named Tom Kalinske, did something nobody thought was possible. They picked a fight. Blast processing. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Sonic the Hedgehog. They went after teenagers while Nintendo chased children, and it worked. By 1992, Sega held 55% of the North American market. In 1993, a company called the 3DO Company, founded by Trip Hawkins, the same man who would later weaponize EA against the Dreamcast, released a 32-bit console at $699. The hardware was genuinely powerful. The price was genuinely insane. But the message it sent to the industry was unmistakable. 16-bit was over. The next generation was coming. Anyone still selling 16-bit hardware was selling yesterday. The price was genuinely insane, but the message it sent to the industry was unmistakable. 16-bit was over. The next generation was coming. Anyone still selling 16-bit hardware was selling yesterday. They had 2 next-generation projects running simultaneously. Project Saturn was a full 32-bit console being developed in Japan. The machine that would eventually launch as the Sega Saturn. It was real hardware, genuine engineering, a proper generational leap. But it was 18 months away from being ready. 18 months in which 3DO and the looming shadow of Sony's PlayStation would eat into consumer confidence in the Genesis. Someone at Sega, the specific decision has never been cleanly attributed, which is itself revealing, proposed a solution. Build a 32-bit add-on for the Genesis, a peripheral that would plug into the existing hardware and boost its capabilities enough to compete with 3DO on specs and price. Call it the 32X. Ship it in time for Christmas 1994. Sega of Japan approved it. Sega of America's Tom Kalinske did not approve it. He argued against it in internal meetings with a clarity that the subsequent history entirely vindicated. His position was simple. You cannot sell consumers a $159 add-on for existing hardware and then ask them to buy an entirely new console 18 months later. They will feel cheated. They will not forgive you. What followed was an engineering sprint that the people who ran it have described in interviews as controlled chaos. The device was designed, manufactured, and shipped to retail in approximately 1 year. For context, most console hardware takes 3 to 5 years from concept to launch. The 32X took 12 months. The compromises that timeline required were visible in the final product in ways that mattered. The library at launch was 6 games. 6. The most technically impressive was a port of Doom that ran adequately. The others were forgettable. The device required its own power adapter in addition to the Genesis power supply. It added a metal mushroom to the top of the console that blocked the cartridge slot and required a pass-through cable. To play regular Genesis games on a 32X equipped console, you had to thread a flat ribbon cable between the two units. The setup looked like surgery. None of this would have been fatal if Sega had committed. If they had said, "This is the platform. These are the games coming. This is the future," developers and consumers might have followed. Companies survive bad hardware launches. They do not survive bad hardware launches, followed immediately by abandonment. The Saturn launched in North America in May 1995, 6 months after the 32X, at $399, with no warning, no transition plan, and no acknowledgement of what this meant for the people who had spent $159 on the peripheral Sega had just finished telling them was the future. Think about that for a second. A consumer who bought a Genesis in 1992 had already spent money on the hardware. If they bought a 32X in November 1994, they had spent another $159. If they bought the Saturn in May 1995, they were now at 3 separate hardware purchases in 3 years, each one rendering the previous one obsolete. Each one sold to them by the same company. The retailers understood what was happening before the consumers did. Electronics Boutique and Babbage's, the two dominant game retail chains of the era, began canceling 32X orders in early 1995. They had watched Sega's messaging shift in real time from "the 32X is the future" to "the Saturn is the future," and they made the only rational calculation available to them. They stopped investing in a platform the manufacturer had already mentally abandoned. By the end of 1995, Sega was selling 32X units at $19.99. The device that had launched at $159 7 months earlier was being cleared from shelves at a price lower than most of the games made for it. The total library across the device's entire lifespan was 40 games. 40. The Super Nintendo, a 16-bit console the 32X had been designed to make obsolete, had over 700. The number that defines the 32X's legacy is not the sales figure or the library size. It is this: Sega manufactured approximately 800,000 units for North America. They sold approximately 665,000. The remaining units were destroyed. Sega paid to manufacture hardware it then paid to physically demolish. What the 32X destroyed was not a product line. Product lines fail. What it destroyed was the specific relationship between Sega and the consumers who had chosen them over Nintendo, who had taken the bet on the underdog, bought the Genesis, bought the accessories, bought into the attitude, and been told repeatedly that their investment was safe. Those consumers bought Saturns at a lower rate than the market expected. They bought PlayStation 1s at a higher rate than Sony had projected. The trust transfer was measurable in unit sales, and it moved in exactly the direction Tom Kalinske had predicted in the internal meetings, where he argued against the 32X and was overruled. Kalinske left Sega in 1996. In interviews, he has been diplomatic about the reasons. The decision-making structure, he has said carefully, made it difficult to execute the strategy he believed was necessary. What he means, reading between the lines of a decade of careful public statements, is that Tokyo kept making calls that America had warned them against, and eventually there was no longer a point in making the warnings. The 32X had one piece of hardware that was genuinely impressive. A chip called the SVP, the Sega Virtua Processor, had been developed for a cartridge called Virtua Racing and produced 3D polygon graphics on Genesis hardware that had no business producing them. The SVP was expensive, it was slow, and it was a proof of concept for what the Genesis could theoretically do at its absolute ceiling. It shipped in one game. It was never used again. The SVP was expensive, it was slow, and it was a proof of concept for what the Genesis could theoretically do at its absolute ceiling. It shipped in one game. It was never used again. There are 32X units in storage facilities across the country right now, still in their original packaging. People bought them in November 1994 and never opened them, and nobody has opened them since, and probably nobody ever will. Not because they are valuable, because they are evidence, a sealed box that proves that Sega once asked its most loyal customers to believe in